I'm going to do is I'm going to conflate my short talk with the music that the 24s are going to sing, and I'm going to drop that. I'm going to drop their bits into what I have to say. It makes it flows rather better, I think. I have the book here. Here's the 1588 publication, as in Edmund Fellowes' version from the 1530s or so. And it says on the front, as you could see from the slide they showed us, the contratenor part. Countertenor, literally someone who doesn't like tenors on the front of it. I'm very aware on a day like this that the room is full of some musicians, some health professionals, some people who just like coming to things at the National Centre, some people who will know more about Byrd than I do, and some people who wouldn't have known about William Byrd. So I will try not to use technical language, and if I do, explain it. All I really want to do is talk a little bit about Byrd, but to talk about the sort of milieu that he found himself in at the time. He's certainly generally regarded as the most important English composer of his time. There's no real argument about that. He was referred to in Tompkins' 1622 book, where he of songs, where he dedicated every single piece to either a member of his family or another musician. With the musicians, it generally just had the name, but when it came to Too Much I Once Lamented, a very beautiful madrigal, he wrote at the top, "To my much reverenced master, Mr. William Byrd." This is Tompkins. No one knows that he even had lessons with Byrd. Maybe it was simply that he had studied his music. In 1622, it's the year before Byrd dies, or possibly the year Byrd dies, at the age of 82. But in fact, some idea of his importance can be gained from the ordinarily and very laconic checkbook of the Chapel Royal, where payments were written down, which on his death in 1623 took the trouble to describe him as a father of music. Accountancy is not known for that kind of graphic detail, but there it was. He lived to the ripe old age of about 82, but during the 1560s and 1570s, he was the modernist, taking ideas from continental Europe and combining caudal writing, sort of hymn-like writing, if you like, where everyone sings together the same words at the same time, with expressive imitative polyphony. Polyphony, music in many parts, where the parts are imitating each other. And I thought we'd begin with a piece of music by him generally regarded as an early-ish work, perhaps from his days as organist at Lincoln Cathedral, which he left aged 30 in 1570. He's born about 1540, and he went to Lincoln in 1563. But young men, early in their careers, do extraordinary things, and this is an 8-voice motet built on imitative polyphony, this technique that the English didn't really do at the time. We were a bit archaic in the early 16th century. We wrote extraordinary things, most famously the masses of Christopher Tye and John Tavener, or music from the Eton Choir book, which was very, very florid, but it wasn't new. It was just an English thing that we did. You can compare it to the sort of buildings it was written from. Whereas imitative polyphony, which Byrd was the first to embrace, and which he copied from Italians working in London, like Alfonso Ferrabosco, but also from part books and scores that were coming over from continental Europe. In that, you have a single shape of music, a single tune, da 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 da, for one line of text. And all the lines that you're writing with have that same tune, but they sing it one after another, maybe just half a second or 2 or 3 seconds after each other, to create a sort of web of sound. And it's extraordinarily difficult to write. We sing so much of it these days, we've become sort of blasé about it. But the great achievement of the 16th century, after 15th century music, which was much more based around melody in the top 2 voices and then supporting lines underneath, was this imitative polyphony. It's a wonderfully democratic form of music making. I've had to edit out the use of the word democratic in my speech today because I wanted to use it so many different times. So each of the 8 parts has roughly the same melody, and one part enters just after the other to create a web of sound built from this just one motif per bit of text. We're going to sing the first half of this motet. It's a big one. It's 9 minutes long. You could imagine it in a big building like Lincoln Cathedral, perhaps up in the choir then. But it's not, it's an astonishingly bold piece, but it's not written for an audience to enjoy, of course. Byrd was a Catholic. This was written for the greater glory of God. It is, though, strangely descriptive of its text. In my distress, I cried unto the Lord, et exaudivit me, and he heard me. O Lord, deliver my tongue from the lip of falsehood and from a deceitful tongue, a lingua dolosa. What should be done unto such things? Sharp arrows, sagittae of the mighty, with searing coals. It's a very grateful piece to sing. It's very well written for singers. If you go back to music of just half a generation before, Taverner and Tie, these long melismatic phrases which you would have to breathe several times in. But who knows whether the piece was ever performed? It was never published. So thinking again of this 1588 volume with the reasons in, let's jump on just 9 years after that. In 1597, an ex-pupil of Byrd, one Thomas Morley, published his plain and easy Introduction to Practical Music. It's essentially a guide to composing. It's not a guide to singing, nor how to play an instrument. Many such volumes on those subjects were published later, though it sort of purports to be. The plain and easy guide is neither plain nor easy. It's written, as was customary, in the style of a dialogue between a pupil and his master. On the opening page, one of the pupils recounts how at a dinner the previous night, and I quote, "But supper being ended, and music books, according to the custom, being brought to the table, the mistress of the house presented me with a part, earnestly requesting me to sing. But when, after many excuses, I protested unfeignedly that I could not, everyone began to wonder how I was brought up. So that upon shame of mine ignorance, I go now to seek out mine old friend, Master Ignoremus, to make myself his scholar." That is, of course, just sales pitch. Make your potential customer feel inadequate so that they buy the book. But it implies that there were enough people out there to buy the book that might have sympathy with such a view, feeling the need to be able to do music. What is interesting is that 60 to 70 years previously, there would have probably been no market for this kind of book. Back then, in the days of Henry VIII, composing was done by those in the know. They might well have studied their undergraduate liberal arts degree, the trivium, with its 3 subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then gone on to their master's degree, the quadrivium, maths, geometry, astronomy, and music. That was the academic side of things. Most of the composers, though, we meet during the 16th century, both in continental Europe and Great Britain, would have been boy choristers at a cathedral. They would have been boy choristers at a cathedral. And with their voices apparently breaking later than their modern counterparts, they would have had an extraordinary level of skill in music generally by the time their voices did break, maybe about age 16. I'm just going to play you a tiny bit of a recording by the choir of Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford. It's good for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's William Cornish's Salve Regina, and that's a marvellous piece from about the 1520s. Secondly, it's sung with boys on the top, obviously modern boys, but there are a couple of very, very good ones in this little excerpt I want to play. Thirdly, it's recorded in Christ Church, which of course was built by Cardinal Wolsey in the 1510s, 1520s, and given to Henry VIII. It's the smallest cathedral in the country, I think, or at least it was when I was at university. And so it's not the sort of Ely Cathedral chapter house massive acoustic that you might associate with the music. Here's just about 50 seconds of this. Extraordinary moment of polyphony. It's not what we're here to talk about, although I could, but it's that if you think of most services like this would be fundamentally plain chant, and then to have a piece like that starting with one voice, I took you in from about 50 seconds into it, into two voices, and then suddenly for the building to be filled with sound, and that word salve, greetings. A very striking moment. So boys would have learnt plain chant to start with, and also this sort of polyphony, music in many parts, singing from just their own part, no score. So this was a hands-on way to a musical education. And then, as now, most of the back rows in such establishments, the lower voices, tenors and basses, would have been made up of ex-boy choristers. They would have gone through that training themselves first. Then, of course, there were instrumentalists. The term is a little bit 20th century, and the likelihood was that all musicians, in fact, did a lot of different things within music, but stick with it for now. Instrumental music had two functions, for playing indoors and for playing outdoors. Loud instruments like shawms, a sort of early oboe, and trumpets, their sound would carry outside, so it could be used for processional and ceremonial music. Towns like York and London had their own group of these called waits. Any of the York waits here today? You never know. No, they do play. A lot of their repertoire was learned by heart and passed down in the family tradition with probably a limited repertoire. It's been suggested that these players liked to keep the repertoire to themselves. You wouldn't want any old person learning how to do it, as that encourages the competition. Same with composing, really. Let's keep it a closed shop. Indoor players, lutes, string instruments, smaller keyboards, their sounds wouldn't carry, but they were good for chamber music, mostly based around arrangements of songs, and increasingly, as the 16th century draws to a close, for repertoire written especially for them. And there's evidence of family dynasties of professional musicians in the 16th centuries associated with particular instruments. Now, what changes this in England and makes us ready for this book are two things. Firstly, the Reformation. Secondly, music printing. The dissolution of the monasteries from the 1530s onwards becomes part of a wider movement to simplify everything, including music, at least in religious terms. Famously, Archbishop Cranmer in the 1540s, when the very Protestant King Edward comes to the throne, declares that composing for the church shall be in English, not in Latin, and that there shall be one syllable per note, so that instead of that melismatic we've just heard, music becomes more hymn-like, so the text can be understood by those listening. That never mattered before. It didn't matter whether you heard the text. It didn't matter whether you heard the priest recount the liturgy. He was saying it, what's the term? AMDG, ad maiorem Deo gratia, ad gloriam, to the greater glory of God. So that is a very Protestant thing that comes in. And that makes music simpler and potentially performable by less trained singers. Secondly, music printing. The system that there was no music printing, there was no meaningful music printing before the 16th century. But in the 1520s, it was invented in England by someone called John Rastall, in relation to Richard, I'm not sure, he's not here today. But it was popularized in continental Europe. And from the 1530s, it becomes quicker and cheaper, so there's more of it, and more people have access to it, the democratization of art, or at least of popular music. In England, we're rather slower off the mark, and there's nothing like the same growth of publications, very few at all, in fact. One of the first dates generally referred to is 1575, when Byrd and his senior colleague Thomas Tallis were given a patent, let's call the whole thing off, by Queen Elizabeth for the printing and marketing of part music and selling lined music paper. You need a license to do it. A trade with only a very limited history in England up to that time. The publication they put out in 1575, 13 years before this, is fair to say the greatest publication of English music in the 16th century, the Canciones Sacrae, songs which, because of their subject matter, are called sacred. Canciones que ab argumento sacre vocantur sunt, or something. You or I would call them motets, and they contain some absolute classics that are regularly sung in cathedrals up and down the country today. But there are two problems with this. Number one, they were in Latin. And although Queen Elizabeth liked Latin herself and was a great supporter of William Byrd, at the time, only the Chapel Royal and the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge were allowed to sing Latin as part of the liturgy. The thought is not that they should be special because they were the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, but the scholars would actually understand the Latin there. Secondly, quite a lot of the pieces in this book were really quite difficult to sing in a modern, rather European musical style. Some of the pieces are clever canons, rounds, which need working out by the performers. Only one line is written, there are instructions, and for some of them you have to turn the book upside down and read it like that in a different clef. So commercially, guess what? The volume was a complete flop. They published nothing more until 1588. And in fact, no music was published in London at all, except in that time, except a book of Genevan psalms in the Protestant manner. So Byrd needed to look elsewhere to make money out of publishing. That didn't mean he stopped writing music. It's thought, in fact, that the 20 years from 1575 to 1595 were his most productive as a composer. But life was complicated for him. He was a Catholic in Church of England, and whereas Queen Elizabeth had famously said when she came to the throne that she wouldn't make a window into men's souls, and Catholics weren't initially punished for continuing to go to Catholic services in the 1560s, early in her reign, things changed after 1570, and the Ridolfi plot against her was uncovered. From then, Catholics were forbidden to go to Catholic services and fined if they did. And the fines then became more steep. And eventually, I think after the Jesuits started sending across Catholic priests in hiding to allow their worshippers to receive the sacrament, it became a treasonable offence. Byrd was fined, but interestingly, at one point in 1592, his prosecution for Catholic activities was halted by direct order of the Queen. Cesset per mandatum reginae, it says. Elizabeth's regard for Byrd was revealed most openly in 1588, the year of our publication today, but also the year of the Spanish Armada, when she had him compose an anthem on words of her own, "Look and bow down," thanking God for its defeat. Byrd also wrote "Rejoice unto the Lord" for her 20th accession day in 1587, and the first known madrigal in her praise, "This sweet and merry month of May," in 1590. I should say, by the way, I'm doing awfully well at the moment, because last night when I went to bed, I started reading some very, very interesting research on swearing, which I couldn't put down. And I had dreams about mixing the two papers up today. And so it's going awfully well so far. So Byrd had connections, but that wasn't helping him sell scores. So he started a series of publications that would have broader appeal. They were also a way of anthologizing music that he'd probably composed over the previous 20 years. From the 1560s, there were manuscript copies of Italian madrigals going around, and there were enough copies of this cheaper foreign music in English hand at this period for us to know that there was an appetite for performing them, not in public concerts, you understand, but to make music at home. And the date of his next publishing of this volume coincides with the first actual publication in English of Italian madrigals by Nicholas Young, a singing man at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. He gathered together a volume of not difficult Italian madrigals from the 1570s and underlaid them with English words. The technical term at the time was Englishing. We were never very good at foreign languages, except possibly Latin. There were 2 further volumes of these in the next 3 years, and this shows a commercial move to take advantage of the existing interest in singing in parts, specifically of madrigals. So 1588 is the year Byrd published this Psalms, Sonnets and Songs. This is only the 3rd book of English songs ever known to have been published, and Byrd seems to have got on with this as Tallis and the other patent holder, a London printer, had both recently died and he had more freedom. The book contains, as it says, psalms, sonnets, and songs. In the preface to the reader, which comes after the reasons to persuade everyone to learn to sing, note that these reasons were absolutely given pride of place, Byrd explains that the book has different types of music in it. And here's what Byrd says, the epistle to the reader. Benign reader, here is offered unto thy courteous acceptation music of sundry sorts, and to content divers humours. If thou be disposed to pray, here are psalms. Important point that. Secular religious music wasn't just liturgical, it would be done at home as well. If to be merry, here are sonnets. If to lament for thy sins, here are songs of sadness and piety. If thou delight in music of great compass, he means a big range, here are divers songs which being originally made for instruments to express the harmony and one voice to pronounce the ditty, are now framed in all parts for voices to sing the same. If thou desire songs of final compass and fit for the reach of most voices, here are most in number of that sort. He then has a bitch about a few other people who don't like his music, as practically every publication. Is it the same in the health world? I don't know, but in music, people always say, don't mention the person's name, but they mention that people are moaning about them. So let's just hear one of these pieces now, remembering that this is chamber music, and therefore the most authentic thing we can do while singing it is enjoy it. So we'll do Amaryllis now.
I force him not, but he is not, sit cold, is what I wait, my sons and tears me there, what shall I but say, hey, how shall
In this 1588 book, Byrd also explained, had been going around in copies with errors in them. So if you want the music as it should be, you have to buy this volume, he's implying. To a general lover of Renaissance music, one of the things you have to get your head around is the predominance of consort songs at the time. Byrd actually never really did madrigals. He wrote only 2 on the same text, the Queen Elizabeth piece, at a time when everyone else had the magical craze, 1590 to 1622. Byrd's vehicle of choice for carrying secular texts was the consort song. Consort song, a 5-part piece, rather like that, but generally with just one vocal part and the others played on instruments. Viols are very good for this, as they allow the text to come through. Can I just check, is it nearly 11 o'clock now? Stephen, was that when my session finished?
No, you've got plenty of time.
Oh, plenty of time. Am I on till 15:15?
You might have a little break.
No, that's fine. Okay, fine. In this 1588 volume, as he's just said in his preface here, he's laid out text to all 5 parts of the pieces, 5 parts of each piece, even though several of them are clearly consort songs, so 4 viols and a voice. However, he clearly marks which is most important, often not the top line, but the second line down. So this idea that the melody is always in the top is not really a very Renaissance thing. Certainly it isn't in imitative polyphony when it's democratic, everyone has the tune. But he seems to enjoy the second line down having the tune. So let's hear now another 5-part consort song. This one seems to have been written rather earlier than 1588. The tune is very much in the second, the other parts having originally been instruments, though the very fact at all of giving them text gives all the singers more of an equal share. And I think we'll sing this and then we'll have that little